Speaker, tonight I'm here on behalf of Pacific Salmon. And Madam Speaker, the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, the main federal program supporting wild salmon restoration, habitat protection, science and rebuilding on the West Coast, sunsets at the end of March. It was not renewed in the budget, and there is still no confirmation of renewal. This puts the single largest federal investment in wild salmon recovery at risk. First Nations, hatcheries, and community restoration groups can't plan projects or keep workers on the ground without certainty. Habitat restoration is not something you can turn on and off. Salmon recovery takes years of steady work. Time is of the essence. If the government is serious about protecting wild salmon and supporting coastal economies, it must renew the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative now. On the West Coast, wild salmon are not an abstract policy issue. They are food security, culture, ecosystem health, local livelihoods, and local economies. Organizations like the Redfish Restoration Society, working with Nuu-chah-nulth Nations, have spent decades restoring watersheds, rebuilding salmon habitat, and training local workers. This is reconciliation in action. We also know from programs like the Watershed Security Fund that restoration works. Dozens of projects have been supported, hundreds of jobs created, and millions leveraged in community investment. Demand far exceeds available funding. Communities are lining up to do the work. If something works, you scale it up. You don't pull the rug out from underneath the people rebuilding wild salmon and protecting watersheds. Now, Madam Speaker, there's also a separate policy discussion underway about the salmon allocation policy. That review is long overdue and tied to court decisions and conservation realities. There has also been a lot of fear stirred up around the salmon allocation policy review. People are being told they'll lose their right to fish, that salmon will stop being a public resource, or that the Constitution is being rewritten. None of that is true. No one is being shut out of the water. Recreation fishing is not being eliminated. Families will still be able to fish. Now, Madam Speaker, some Conservatives have chosen to stir fear instead of engaging honestly with the law, the science, and the reality facing wild salmon. At the same time, the Liberal government has failed to clearly explain what this review is and what it's not, allowing misinformation to spread. What is actually happening is long overdue. Courts have ruled that Indigenous fishing rights must be meaningfully accommodated. Outdated policy from 1999 has failed to reflect that reality, and at the same time, many wild salmon stocks are still in decline. Conservation and rebuilding must come first, because without healthy wild salmon, there is no fishery for anyone. What is most troubling is the double standard we're hearing from some Conservatives. They show up at rallies and town halls and tell fishers one story, then they come back to Ottawa, sit at the Fisheries and Oceans Committee with the minister and her officials for 2 hours, Madam Speaker, and don't raise these concerns at all. They have not once raised the sunsetting of the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, the most critical salmon funding we have, nor the concerns they claim to have heard about the salmon allocation policy either at committee or here in the House of Commons. As New Democrats, we're clear about where we stand. Our positions are evidence-based and expert-led. We stand for conservation first because without wild salmon, there is no fishery. We stand for rebuilding salmon so there is a future for all fishers, good jobs in coastal communities, and strong local economies. We stand for respecting the law and Indigenous rights, and we stand for stable, long-term funding so restoration doesn't collapse every few years. The government must move now, quickly on these decisions related to both the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative and the Salmon Allocation Policy Review. Organizations, communities, and businesses need transparency and certainty. Delays create real costs on the ground. Madam Speaker, coastal communities are running out of time, and the government must act now. Time is of the essence.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member opposite for truly a good question, and he listed a lot of the things he stood for, and I was honoured to sit with that member when we were on the Fisheries Committee together many years ago, and I know him to be a genuine leader and a friend of reconciliation in this House. And so I'm really happy to be here on behalf of the Minister of Fisheries, where I would like to talk a little bit about how Pacific salmon populations are experiencing long-term and historic declines due to the impacts of climate change, pollutants, and changes in land and water use. To address these challenges, the government has invested $686 million since 2021 to implement decisive actions under the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative. We have restored over 18.5 million square meters of Pacific salmon habitats and advanced watershed-scale salmon rebuilding planning with partners including for West Coast Vancouver Island Chinook salmon. During the summer of 2024, Fisheries and Oceans worked with 60 partners in 75 areas across British Columbia to respond to immediate drought-related issues, fund emergency projects, and support fish passage to spawning areas with critical restoration projects. We have provided a further $90 million for 73 projects through Phase 2 of the British Columbia Salmon Restoration and Innovation Fund to protect and restore Pacific salmon habitats and other priority wild fish stocks. Under the Salmon Enhancement Pillar of the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, we're expanding our hatchery infrastructure and upgrading 47 hatcheries to boost at-risk salmon in priority areas. We are developing new hatchery management tools to optimize sustainable harvest and rebuilding outcomes for more than 250 Pacific salmon stocks. Through the Harvest Transformation Pillar of the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative, we have retired 473 commercial Pacific salmon licenses, reducing the total number of eligible salmon license holders by 35.7%. In terms of Indigenous fisheries, Fisheries and Oceans Canada has collaborated with more than 40 First Nations and Indigenous fisheries organizations on over 60 Indigenous Harvest Transformation Partnership projects to transition fisheries to more selective fishery methods and improved monitoring while reducing impacts on vulnerable salmon stocks. Fisheries and Oceans Canada has also piloted 6 selective fisheries. And we've heard in committees and we've heard across this country that the salmon means so much more to First Nations all across Canada, especially BC, that it's not just about fishing, it's about culture, it's about lessons, it's about their stories, it's about their culture. And so in June 2024, Fisheries and Oceans Canada, First Nations in British Columbia, and the province of British Columbia signed a new trilateral accord to coordinate and align conservation restoration efforts to improve outcomes for salmon over the long term. We are advancing targeted efforts in the Yukon, including investments in First Nation salmon, fisheries transition, stewardship and monitoring activities, and integrated rebuilding planning. Pacific salmon holds a deep socio and cultural significance for the people of the West Coast of Canada. The government remains committed to the long-term health and sustainability of these vital fishery resources. Through Fisheries and Oceans Canada, work under the Pacific Strategy Initiative, including our continued collaboration with First Nations harvesters, stakeholders, and the Government of British Columbia and Yukon. Meaningful progress is being made to address conservation challenges and support sustainable salmon harvesting over the long term.
Member for Courtenay-Alberni.
Madam Speaker, I appreciate my colleague talking about the record amount of funding invested in wild salmon and its success, and I have a lot of respect for him. But now's not the time to take our foot off the gas. The answer tonight doesn't give coastal communities what they need. Certainty. The Pacific Salmon Treaty Initiative is set to expire in just over a month, and we still don't have a clear commitment on its renewal. That puts restoration work, good jobs, and real progress on wild salmon recovery at risk. First Nations, hatcheries, and community restoration groups, they can't plan without stable, long-term funding. Habitat restoration isn't something you turn on and off. Time is of the essence. There's also a separate review underway of the salmon allocation policy. People deserve honest communication about what that review is and what it's not. No one is losing their right to fish. Recreation fishing is not being eliminated, but conservation and rebuilding must come first, because without healthy salmon, there is no fishery for anyone. Coastal communities are waiting. This Liberal government needs to move quickly, provide transparency, and commit now to renewing wild salmon restoration funding.
Parliamentary Secretary.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I hear the urgency in my colleague's voice. I just want him to know that we are urgently discussing this. We are making sure that our processes with our partners are collaborative. And we're going to ensure that the government continues to move forward with the investment of $686 million over 5 years to implement decisive actions under the Pacific Salmon Strategy Initiative to meet these challenges. We recognize the importance of long-term measure for the sustainability of Pacific salmon of the West Coast. we have accomplished many targeted initiatives to date, including restoring more than 18.5 million square meters of salmon habitat, retiring more than 400 commercial licenses, upgrading fisheries in Oceans Canada and community hatchery infrastructure, and supporting sustainable fishing opportunities while reducing its impact on valuable stocks. I recognize the social, economic, and cultural importance of Pacific salmon for Canadians. The government is committed to the long-term health and sustainability of our vital fisheries resources and is confident that the department's progress.
And we are done.